Okay, Chairman, we are now live.
Thank you, Wendy. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the East Devon District Council's virtual Strategic Planning Committee meeting on the 16th of September 2020. I'm your chairman, Dan Ledger. I would also like to welcome anyone watching this meeting via the live streaming. All participants here today are taking part remotely, and as well as being live streamed, the meeting is being recorded. So please bear this in mind throughout, and may I remind you to be careful with your language. May I also remind members that the Code of Conduct applies throughout the meeting. We also reserve the right to remove and disconnect any participant who is disrupting the meeting by whatever means. As the Strategic Planning Committee is depending on an internet connection and a power supply, in the event of a break in the internet connection or a power cut, please bear with us as we try to reconnect. After 15 minutes, if we're not able to reconnect, we will consider the meeting adjourned and reconvene at a later date. Please check the committee page on our website for details. Please make sure all phones are switched off or turned on to silent, and make sure all microphones are muted when you're not speaking to avoid unnecessary background noise. Keep points short and do not repeat points that have already been made, and do not interrupt. If you wish to make a comment, please raise your electronic blue hand and wait to be called. All councillors have been sent an agenda for today's meeting. Any members of the public who wish to view the agenda can do so by visiting our website, www.eastdevon.gov.uk. We will now start the meeting by doing a roll call of committee members here present. Can you please now unmute your microphones, and when you hear your name, please confirm by saying present. When you have confirmed you're present, please mute your microphone again.
Okay, so I'll start the roll call. Thank you, Chairman. So obviously you are here. Thank you. Councillor Allen. Not with us. Councillor Arnold, I know, is a latecomer to the meeting, will be joining us shortly. Councillor Blakey.
Present.
Thank you. Councillor Chamberlain.
Present.
Thank you. Councillor Davey.
Present.
Councillor Hayward.
Present. Would you be able to rename me on the screen as from your host platform, Wendy or Debbie?
I'll do that shortly, thank you. I'll complete the roll call first, thank you. Councillor Hookway, please.
Present.
Councillor Howe.
Present.
Councillor Ingham.
Present.
Councillor McLaughlin has sent her apologies. Councillor Moulding will be joining us slightly later. I'll let you know when he arrives. Councillor Rylance, please.
Present.
Thank you. Councillor Skinner.
Present.
Thank you. And Councillor Thomas.
Present.
Thank you. Okay, Chairman, we are called to continue. So, Chairman, would you like to continue with item 1?
I'm muted there. Apologies. So agenda item number 1, public speaking. Do we have any members of the public wishing to speak?
So we did have one member of the public who is unable to join us live online, but has issued a statement, and I'll read that out on his behalf, if that's okay with you, Chairman.
Of course.
So this has been provided from Councillor Copas, who's from Ottery St Mary, and his statement reads as follows. As Chairman of the Planning Committee of Ottery St Mary Town Council, the Council's views on the Planning White Paper were made clear in the minutes of the last Planning Committee and the local press. Our Council's chief concern is the lack of democratic accountability that the White Paper proposes. I would strongly ask that the District Council write to our MP asking him to fully address this matter. That's the end of the statement, Chairman.
Thank you, Debbie, and thank you to Councillor Copas. I'm sure we'll address that later on in the meeting. So agenda item number 2, minutes from the previous meeting, pages 3 to 10. If anyone has any comments on the set of meeting or the set of minutes from the 27th of July, please do so by raising your electronic blue hand. If I see any blue hands, if no blue hands are raised, I'll take that they're all agreed. Councillor Mike Howe.
It's not really on the minutes, but it is about the minutes and obviously my behaviour at that meeting. I owe a heartfelt apology to Mr. Ed Freeman. it was not a good day for me that time. And I've also emailed the chairman to say, if I go like it again, please cut me off. I was unfortunately suffering. I'm diabetic and I was suffering low blood sugar. So the words I was speaking were not fully thought together in any shape or form. But it came across when I replayed it after being asked to do so by a friend on the committee. I was horrified of how I behaved, Mr. Freeman. And I know I spoke to you last week and apologised then, but I apologise sincerely. That's not the way I expect any of us, particularly myself, but any of us to behave with officers who are doing the best they can at all times. So just apologies to committee, but obviously mainly to Mr. Freeman, who is the one under the wrath of my words last time, which was not well put together. Sorry. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Howe. I'm sure it's appreciated. Just going back to the minutes, I don't see any further blue. Ooh, Phil Skinner.
I just want to add, well done, Mike, for putting that up, because the officers do not need to be attacked from councillors when they don't have the ability to respond. My suggestion is that if any councillors have issues with officers, they take them up in their own time and not be doing it in the public arena. But Mike, well done, well said, well put forward. Let's move on, put it all behind us. Thank you.
If we can keep on to the actual agenda item, which is the minutes, let's stay there. Does anyone else have any comments to make on the minutes? No? Okay, I'll take those as agreed. So agenda item number 3, apologies. Do we have any apologies?
Yes, just from Cathy McLaughlin, Councillor Cathy McLaughlin.
Thank you, Wendy. So agenda item number 4, declarations of interest. This will be done by a roll call via Wendy.
Thank you. Councillor Blakey.
Yes, President.
Sorry, Councillor, was that?
Sorry.
Any declarations?
Sorry, no.
Thank you. Councillor Chamberlain.
No declarations of interest.
Councillor Davey.
No declarations.
Councillor Hayward.
Yes, thank you. The usual 3 for the 3 parish councils I work for in respect of, I suppose, 7, 8 and 9. In the under 7 and 8, they'll all be making planning applications and will be bound by these regulations. And in item 9, 2 of them are recipients of SIL, so your charging schedule will directly affect their parish finances. Thank you.
For items 7, 8 and 9, could you state the parish councils that you're clerking?
Of course,
for?
yeah. So for 7 and 8, it will be for All Saints Parish Council, Chardstock Parish Council, and Newton Poppleford and Hertford Parish Council. For item 9, my belief is only Chardstock Parish Council and Newton Poppleford and Hertford Parish Council have been recipients of SIL to date. But of course, that may change. So probably best for all 3 of them for 7, 8 and 9. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Hookway.
No declarations, thank you.
Councillor Howe.
None that I can think of, apart from I'm a member of a parish council similar to previous.
Which parish council was that, Councillor Howe?
Bishop's Cliff Parish Council.
Thank you. Councillor Ingham.
None.
Councillor Ledger.
None, thank you.
Councillor Rylance.
I'm a member of Broadcliffe Parish Council, which inevitably at some point along the way will receive SIL payments.
Thank you. Councillor Skinner.
None that I'm aware of at the moment. I'm sure if something comes up, I could raise it then. Thank you.
Finally, Councillor Thomas.
None, thank you, Wendy.
Thank you.
Wendy, just
Wendy.
a slight change.
Sorry, Dan.
I haven't added in I am a member of Seaton Town Council, but that's obviously on my register of interest anyway.
Thank you.
Wendy, could I just add in that I'm on Broadcliffe Parish Council as well, and like Eleanor, it may affect the SIL.
Yeah, I've made a note.
I'm on
Thank
Exmouth
you.
Town Council as well, Wendy.
Councillor Davey, Exmouth Town Council. Lovely. Thank you very much. All noted.
Thank you, Wendy. So agenda item number 5, matters of urgency. There are no matters of urgency to discuss. Agenda item number 6, confidential and exempt items. There are no confidential exempt items which officers recommend should be dealt with in this way. So we move on to the main part of the agenda. Agenda item 7, changes to the current planning system. The August 2020 consultation. Proposed response page is number 11. Ed Freeman to present his report. Over to you, Ed. Could I just quickly remind all members, could you put your microphones on mute? Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. So this is the first of 2 consultations from the government to be considered in this afternoon's meeting, and proposes a number of short-term measures to improve the effectiveness of the current planning system. There are effectively 4 main proposals being proposed here, the first of which is changes to the standard method for assessing housing need. So members will be aware that the government introduced a few years ago the standard method that tells us how many homes per year we are required to deliver as a local planning authority. They are proposing to amend the calculation of that. So the new method, like the old, would be based on a baseline of household growth, including births, deaths and migration trends, but it would now relate these to the existing housing stock to give a bottom line level of provision. Now in East Devon, demographic projections exceed the baseline, so that doesn't actually impact on us in terms of how it's calculated. What does impact on East Devon is that the new calculation puts greater weight on the affordability of the housing stock. Previously, this was capped under the previous methodology, but that cap is being lifted, and so the gap we experience between house prices and earnings in East Devon, which I believe is about 9.3 times salaries to earnings to mortgage to house prices, sorry. And so that has much greater influence on the housing numbers now in East Devon, and leads to our housing numbers increasing to 1,614 homes per year. This obviously raises significant implications for us in terms of where and how such growth could be accommodated, and whether, even if they are planned for, whether they would actually be built. There would obviously also be significant environmental implications in delivering this level of growth in the district. More on that, no doubt, as we go through into the planning white paper, which also addresses that proposal as well. The second main proposal in this consultation is about delivering first homes. Members will hopefully recall that first homes are available to first-time buyers to buy at a 30% discount off market value. It's proposed that 25% of all affordable homes should be first homes, with 2 options presented for the remainder. The first being that it either reflects local authority policy, so in our case a 70-30 split in tenure for the remainder, or alternatively they're seeking views on whether or not that should be separately negotiated. The consultation proposes exemptions where the requirements for first homes would not apply, including where the proposal provides only build for rent homes, specialist accommodation, self or custom build, or exclusively affordable housing. It also proposes some transitional arrangements for plans that have already been submitted for examination, so local plans, neighbourhood plans that have been submitted for examination within 6 months would be exempt from including this policy. Similarly, pre-application discussions that are currently going on through the development management process would be exempt, though they don't give a detailed timescale in the consultation for that. Proposals for the level of discount to be varied at a local level are also included. So this could be important for East Devon, where the standard 30% discount is unlikely to make home ownership affordable to many people in the district. But obviously, if we have the opportunity to increase that to perhaps 40 or 50%, then that could have a significant impact on delivering affordable homes in the district, or certainly a greater impact. The proposals also allow for first home sites to come forward as exception sites. Members will probably be familiar with rural exception sites, but they've also introduced the option for first home exception sites on urban areas. This could only happen in East Devon and sites on the edge of Exmouth, Honiton, Seaton and Sidmouth, because the rest of the district is classified as rural in the government's eyes. However, the changes would mean that you could have exception sites in excess of 1 hectare in area in those locations under the proposed changes in this consultation, whereas currently they could not exceed that size. The third change in the consultation is about supporting small and medium-sized developers. Proposals in this section include to raise the threshold for affordable housing to be required from 10 or more unit sites to 40 or 50 unit sites in urban areas. Again, those urban areas being Exmouth, Honiton, Seaton and Sidmouth in the case of East Devon. This sounds on the face of it like quite a dramatic change and easing of affordable housing requirements, but in reality our records suggest that the number of affected sites in East Devon is likely to be small, and so the likely loss of affordable housing would not be that significant. However, it does obviously raise wider implications about whether or not this genuinely helps small and medium-sized developers and the extent to which there are loopholes that others may wish to exploit. So there's more detail of that obviously in the report. The final proposal is about the extension of permission in principle. Members may recall permission in principle is intended to be a simplified route to gaining an in-principle agreement to a proposal. It's proposed to extend that so that currently it can only be used on small developments of less than 10 dwellings in size. It's proposed to extend that to sites of over 10 dwellings in size and introduce a potential new fee structure and publicity arrangements for such applications. So far, permission in principle has not been taken up in East Devon. We've not had a single application for permission in principle, with our customers tending to favour the traditional route of outline planning permission, which is better understood by them and financial institutions that they use. So our comments tend to reflect that in terms of that permission in principle has not been very successful, certainly in East Devon. So there's detailed comments on each of the proposals and a draft response into the consultation questions in the report, and these responses are recommended for members' agreement. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Freeman. So, as Mr. Freeman said, the recommendation is to note the report and agree the proposed responses to the consultation. I'll first open it up to non-committee members. If you could start by raising your hands if you wish to speak, and then I'll come to actual members of the committee. Councillor Megan Armstrong.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just getting to my papers again. I'm just concerned, Ed. I just want, could you explain a little bit more about the first homes, because that does concern me. So it's delivering first homes for purchase. When you said elsewhere in your report that the great need in East Devon is for social housing and affordable to rent housing. And I'm just anxious that the delivering of first homes to buy with a 30% discount of market value is going to reduce the number of affordable housing we have available to rent. And I have to keep banging that drum because that's really important. Now, I may have just misunderstood your answers to that, so I just need some clarification, if you don't mind, please, Chair. Thank you for Ed to answer. Thank you.
No problem. Ed, do you want to come back there?
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Yes, just to reassure Councillor Armstrong, we have produced the proposed responses in consultation with the Housing Service, and Melissa Wall has been involved in helping us to draft these responses. She has raised some concerns, as you say, and it's incorporated into our response to question 8 about how this might impact on the viability for registered providers to deliver other forms of affordable housing. And the second paragraph of that response refers to that, because what we're saying is that affordable housing providers need certainty about their cash flow and the lump sum of cash that they would receive for those units. And the First Home Scheme brings in a greater element of uncertainty into that. And there's a loss of cross-subsidisation within that as well, which they currently receive from shared ownership homes, which would potentially be reduced. So we tried to address those concerns in the response to question 8, which is page 21 in the agenda.
Yeah. Yes, because I think I haven't got the. I'm either looking at you or I'm looking at the papers. I can't look at both at the same time. I'm sorry, but I think it's in response to this particular question where it gives 2 options, and I think you've gone for the first option. I'm hoping I've got the right section here, and when I read it, and I may well just be misunderstanding it, I just wondered if there was an opportunity for you, or if you felt it was appropriate to just say, I don't agree with either option, actually, none of the above sort of thing, or perhaps I've just misunderstood, or I may be in the wrong section. I'm sorry if I'm confusing everybody, but I can't see the papers at the minute. Sorry about that, Ed. Do you understand what I'm trying to say, or am I just confusing everything?
Through you, Chairman, I mean, it's open to members. Obviously, there are 2 options stated. We don't have to agree with either of them. Our preference as officers is that we're able to secure the same mix of affordable housing from the remainder of the affordable housing, i.e. 75% that won't be first homes, based on our existing policy in terms of the split. But if members wish to respond and say we're not happy with either option, or simply we don't agree with first homes, then that's within their gift.
Yeah, thank you, Ed, through the chair. Yeah, I feel more reassured. You have been talking obviously to our housing officers about this, because I know concerns were expressed when this first came up a few weeks ago by a couple of the housing officers. So if they're happy with your response, then I'll go with that. I don't want to stir things up unnecessarily, and between you as officers, I think we have to just accept your professional advice at this stage. I think, yeah, thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Armstrong. Are there any other non-members of the committee that wish to speak on this? Okay, we'll bring it into the committee. Councillor Mike Allen.
Thank you, Chair. I looked in detail through Ed Freeman's responses, and absolutely fine, nothing to quarrel with, which I hope Ed will find quite unusual. The key question for me is at the beginning. The government's proposed method of standard housing requirements, they've already revised it once in the current local plan, and then they messed it up and revised it again in 2018. It actually required fewer houses to be built. Then, after a great deal of investigation throughout our local plan, we checked again and again what is a reasonable level of housing development, to suddenly find much of our local authorities in our area suddenly asked to increase by 50, 60, 70% is ludicrous. There is something fundamentally wrong in the algorithm. And secondly, this kind of dirigist central forecast, while it may sound good to people in the Parliament, it shows no relevance whatever to local democracy and reality on the ground. And I totally agree with what Ed Freeman has put forward as recommendations. All I would say is, Ed, there are 1 or 2 spelling mistakes. Could you just check it before it goes off? Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Allen. Councillor Bellingham.
Thank you, Chair. Whilst I support what Ed's put in, and I understand that because it will fit in with a government requirement and push them in the hopefully the right direction. The great shame for me is that while we're not maximising the number of social housing or affordable housing, that actually means we're building houses we don't need on sites we need to use. And this isn't a new problem, it's been going on for about 30 years. It's just disappointing that yet again, during a time of climate emergency, we failed to, or national government fails to embrace the need to build only the houses we need on the sites we've got, rather than making a fast buck. And then, of course, in 10, 20 years' time, someone else having to pick up our problem. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Ingham. Councillor Allen, as you weren't here for the beginning of the meeting, do you have any declarations of interest you wish to declare?
No, Chair, I'm sorry. I was having conversations with a parliamentarian.
Thank you. Councillor Ian Thomas.
Thank you, Chair. It's not been a good summer for the government and algorithms, has it really? With the fiasco in education, we all saw what happened, that you start at one extreme, jump to the other, then move back again. I wonder whether we're about to see another one in the same relation to the housing numbers, because it's something, the table on page 18 is pretty pertinent in terms of setting out the former GESP area local authorities and their projected housing requirements under this wonderful new algorithm. It's unfortunate, I guess the only comment I'd made there is, were we all still working together with Exeter, the overall percentage required would actually be lower. But that aside, I think it's the key point to challenge in all of this, with all the constraints on development we have, and also the questionable demand. But for numbers from one algorithm to another developed over the course of a few months to jump by 76% in our case and 102% in Teambridge cases worries me enormously. It isn't credible, I'm sorry. It's something that we should be referring that back and seeking a lot more quite specific information about the working of the algorithm, where it came from, what its justification is, rather more detail than we've been provided with here. So that would be my only comment. I'd strengthen Ed's wording up in his response to the, not the detail in the individual things, but the overall numbers, because that's what we've got to question first. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Thomas. Come next to Councillor Paul Arnott. Paul, as you weren't here at the start of the meeting as well, do you have any declarations of interest you wish to declare?
Thank you, Chair. No, none to declare. And apologies, I was in a Team Devon meeting. We were just talking about COVID. And my pulse has only just gone down. Yes, GESP, it's been raised by Ian, so let's deal with that very quickly. I was lucky enough to be in a webinar yesterday with Robert Jenrick, the Housing Secretary, as you know, and he actually introduced a special guest at the top of this webinar. Nobody less than the Prime Minister himself, who gave us a sort of 5-minute spitting image style oration full of sound and fury and signalling nothing whatsoever about this. Jenrick then made a key comment, which I'll direct to Ian and hope it makes him sleep easier at night. We've dodged a bullet on GESP. What he said was, when they're looking at growth areas, and if you remember, it's been divided into these 3 chunks. Growth areas, which then get more or less automatic planning permission. It's outlined, but it's there and it can't be reversed, are and will be counted, if this goes ahead, as existing large scale allocations That is what he'd said. So if we had been naive enough to go ahead with guests, gone out to consultation with these large scale allocations all over the guest area, those would probably now be irreversible. So I think we did a very good thing and we dodged a bullet. The only other two things I'd like to say are absolutely pay credit to Ed. This is an excellent report, but I'm hoping this doesn't make him blush too much. I'd like to pay credit to the chair of the Strategic Planning Committee as well, who I know has been working very closely and inputting into this with Ed throughout the preparation of this report. So thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Arnott. We'll move on to Councillor Phil Skinner.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm not sure some of what Councillor Arnott has just said, where that's going to land. I think I'll do my own investigations regarding that. As far as using language like dodged a bullet, I would not have thought so. In fact, I think it's quite the opposite. I agree with Councillor Thomas. But what is absolutely relevant here is the algorithms, and this is the point what Councillor Thomas was remarking on, the algorithms being used. And it has to be said that the algorithms being used when there was a number just only a few months ago to the change algorithms, and all of a sudden there's a jump, and according to looking at the papers here that you presented, Ed, and very well I might add, an increase of 67%. I've never been one for challenging long established housing numbers, because I've always thought that the Office of National Statistics have worked these sort of figures out over a long time. But the jumping around with these figures and moving at the 11th hour of 67% is a massive change. And it's not something that I am just that I feel that we should just be just accepting without some sort of explanation, some sort of where are we with this. So I put it to Ed that I think that we collectively, and over this side of the floor, without conservative bashing from the other side of the floor all the time using political stancing, that we get to a place where we can understand and have conversations with the planning department, or the certainly central government, to see where these figures have come, because these are massive changes. It's not a little bit of a change. It's not 1 or 2% or 5%. It's 67%. It's a massive change. And so I'm absolutely in agreement with the wording and the way that Councillor Ian Thomas put over his viewpoint. And I think that's where we need to start and have a discussion around that before moving on with these massive numbers that we've got at the moment. So I'm struggling with these numbers, and I think we need to be doing something about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Skinner. Move on to Councillor Eleanor Ryland.
Thank you, Chair. So I had a question for Ed. So reading through the report, it seems I really, really like the report, by the way. I like the focus of it, and I like the way it was written. And I do, however, agree with Councillor Aaron, there are a few spelling mistakes, so it does need slightly proofreading a bit. So my question is, it seems from the way you phrase your report that the uplift in the number of houses that we're expected to build comes more from the dodgy algorithm that produces that aims to reduce the price of houses than from any perceived actual need. Is that right? And also, do we have any actual evidence whether building lots and lots of houses has managed to drive down the price of houses anywhere? I mean, do we have some concrete evidence of that? I like the focus on evidence, by the way, Ed. It was really good. So that's my question. Do we have any evidence that it works?
Ed, do you need a few minutes, or do you want to come back?
No, it's okay. I mean, I think the argument is one of simple supply and demand, in that if you oversupply, then compared to demand, then logically prices come down. I've seen limited evidence of that happening, because the numbers of new homes, as you can see from the outcome of the calculator, that need to be provided are so much higher to achieve that, that it's quite difficult. We did have some evidence that I think in 1 year, about 5 or 6 years ago in the West End, we saw some change in terms of that profile because of the high numbers being delivered at Cranbrook. but that was also contributed to, I think, by economic change through the jobs being provided in that part of the district and increasing salaries. So to what extent the housing numbers impacted versus the economic change is difficult to say. And I think that just goes to show that there are lots of other measures that have probably a greater impact on the affordability gap than the number of houses. Structural change in the economy, increasing salaries, increasing lending to first-time buyers and others, for example, are probably far more likely to have an impact on addressing the affordability gap than vastly increasing the number of homes that are built, and are probably far easier to achieve, would be my thoughts on that.
Thank you, Ed. Eleanor, does that answer the question for you?
Yeah, thank you. That does answer the question for me. So yeah, it really does. Thank you.
Perfect, thank you. Councillor Paul Hayward.
Thank you, Chair. I'm delighted by the comprehensive nature of this report, and I think it goes a long way to rebutting some inconceivably ill-founded notions from central government. And I'm heartened that cross-party here we have agreement that central government has got it wrong. I am mindful that the CPRE has been putting forward comments for years that housing numbers in Devon, CPRE Devon, are wrong. And yet I recall at recent strategic planning meetings going back a couple of years that was poo-pooed, that the evidence was flawed, it was using bad data. And yet here we are now all seemingly agreeing that, that they got their sums right, and that there is too much onus put on numbers from a centrally provided source. Again, I mean, Ed has touched on a very valid point that if you start with a number at central government which has no basis and work backwards, you'll always end up in this situation. There's no evidence provided. And so had the government decided that 500,000 houses was the target with no substantiation, and who knows, they might decide to do that, then we'd have an even bigger problem. But yes, I think we do need, as a district council, united across parties to go back and rebut what has been put forward. We have evidence, we have some proof. So that's a very positive step from strategic planning. I think the issue of housing need and the numbers is, what are houses for? It seems to me that houses are for people to live in, to enjoy the standard of their life, to enjoy their human rights to a peaceful life and security, not to be used as the means to enrich people. And Ed has alluded to that here, that you simply just build more and more houses. They're not for people to live in, they're for people to buy, to use as buy-to-lets for private tenancies. So we need a change of focus, and we're talking already about housing forums and panels to come up with a way of providing better housing for the people of East Devon. And it doesn't necessarily have to be ownership. A great many people would be happy to rent a clean, dry, reasonably sized house, not a rabbit hutch, with a garden to enjoy their life. And I think that's a focus that we need to have. It's not all about profit. It's about sometimes just the basic humanity of providing people with safe tenure for themselves and their families without enriching people further up the food chain. So I'm very heartened by this. And I think, yes, we should push back, and we should do the right thing for the people of East Devon and not for the privileged few. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hayward. Councillor Mike Howe, I'll come to you next, as you haven't spoke yet.
Thank you very much. Strange way of coming about this, I have. Mr. Freeman, how can we, with a district that has 2/3 AOMB, we'll ignore all the triple SIs and everything else as well, but stick with AOMBs, build houses in the AOMB? Because if we don't build houses in the AOMB, the ratio of affordability in those areas is going to be even greater than the small area that we can build in. The 1/3 of the district we could put all these houses, which we can't, by the way, but that's the separate way of doing it. You know, so I'm actually very heartened by your report, but this will never work when areas like Seaton, Beer, etc., Sidmouth, the amount of houses they would need in those areas that are surrounded and landlocked by AONB to reduce the value there to a proportionate amount of the earnings, it would just take up too much of the AONB. And we've got to be really careful and point out to government about our AONB problem, because that's where the worst of the differentiation is. But they're not offering a solution to that. Quite rightly, the AONBs are still protected. We will have to build in them, absolutely. But, you know, it's got to be done carefully and with consideration. And I'm just wondering if it needs tweaking somewhere along there to highlight that disparity of this will help Exeter, the numbers, which has never achieved its 5.5-year housing land supply as long as I can remember, but not really help us, as we've got the vast part of the district with much higher values of homes. So I'm just wondering, for the life of me, I can't work out how to tweak it, but hopefully, Mr. Freeman, you might have some thoughts and some ideas on that. Sorry.
Thank you, Councillor Howell. I think it's a great contribution. Ed, do you have any comments to that?
I mean, I think again, it's a good point. We are a heavily constrained district. I think it's slightly strange how the government have done this, because we've got this consultation addressing partly the standard method, and then the white paper also addresses the standard method. In the white paper, the government talk about the numbers taking account of local constraints, but it doesn't say how or when or by whom or anything. And so perhaps some of the comments that we've made to the white paper might be a better place for Councillor Howe's concerns, because that's where these local constraints are raised in the consultation. And we need to understand how the government hopes to take account of those issues and how that might impact on our figures. I think suggestions are that the figures are one thing, and then there might be some factoring down where there are local constraints. But without understanding how and when that might happen and how that would be done, it's very difficult to comment. So I think our comments to the questions in the white paper are very much that needs to be understood in order to respond in any detail to those proposals.
Thank you, Ed.
Could I just come back, Mr. Chair, 1 second?
Of course.
Thank you. Thank you, Ed, for that. And I agree with you totally. I suppose my question goes slightly more in that direction, though. If we've got constraints, which we know we have got, and the government of the land taking off housing numbers that they had hoped, never would, but had hoped to reduce that gap between affordability and earnings, those constraints and that lowering of our numbers will inevitably, whatever way you do it, make the situation worse. And I mean, I really, I think you're right. I think I'll leave it till we come to that next consultation and maybe try and address it stronger there. But whatever we do, we've got to be really careful how we put this, because it's not just about the land we haven't got. It's about the affordability that we will never solve. So it's a chicken and egg, and it really is. We need to be really careful about it. But thank you very much, Ed.
Okay, we'll move on to Councillor Phil Skinner. If we could keep the points brief now as we're going back through and just work towards an actual proposal.
I think lots of the points have been said. I think actually I was going to respond to Councillor Haywood about the word of socialism, but I think I'll leave that for the minute. We'll move on.
Thank you. Councillor Ian Thomas.
Thank you, Chair. 4 very quick points. Firstly, from Ed's response to Mike's excellent input there, it looks like we're dealing with yet another half-cooked algorithm, which reinforces my view and concern from right at the beginning that whipping numbers out of midair, frankly, just is not acceptable with so many caveats. We need to understand this much better. Second point is, despite all the investment in HS2 and the like, members will probably be aware that the Northern Powerhouse is actually seeing a decrease, is my understanding, in these numbers in relation to a previous situation. So obviously all the investment going up north, where it's pretty grim, as you know, is obviously not hitting the right place, whereas I'm not aware of any similar investment due to be coming down to the southwest. Third point quickly, Ed, I'm sorry, going back to page 18 and these numbers, the numbers don't add up. So just a quick caution note, for example, if you go from up 67% from 928 to 1614, that's not correct, it's actually 74%. But also if you look at the 928 there and 918 in the table, the 918 figure through the table is correct at 76%. So all I would suggest is, if we're going out to people on these, can we make sure, if I've made a mistake or misunderstood, please let me know. But other than that, can we make sure that the figures are actually correct? Because the margins of error we're introducing through ourselves there reinforce the felony of government algorithms. Is that the East Devon influence on those? We'll actually change the numbers. Finally, as far as the resolution, which is what actually goes forward from the meeting today, recognising the points that I and others have made here and the questioning of the numbers and how they've been achieved, do we need to amend the resolution accordingly? Because it doesn't sound anything like beefy enough to me to reflect the flavour of the discussion. Perhaps Chair or Ed, you could express your view, and if need be, I'm happy to propose a strengthened amendment, or if not, leave it to you guys.
I think it's completely down to committee if they want to change the actual proposals, but from the discussion that's been said today, there haven't been any amendments. It's just that the committee want to change the flavour of everything. And it's, if you want to come now and actually give definite proposal changes, bring them forward. I think this is the forum to do it at. We can't really bring it back again. We're against time at the moment.
And then just a simple, the recommendation, the committee note the report and agree proposed responses, but which has specifically noted the requirement to better understand the algorithm, government algorithm that lies behind the figures, and highlighting the sensitivity to the scale of change that's come forward over 2 successive algorithms, which the government, as we know, is very good at this summer, over the course of just a short period of time. We need some words to that effect.
Shirley, did you get all of that?
I'm just trying to unmute. No, I didn't. Is there? I would just like to ask Councillor Thomas: is there a response to one of the specific questions that would be better amended to reflect our unease with the algorithm that is being used?
But personally, I don't think so, Shirley, because it's not strong enough. That's one of the things that runs fundamental right the way through the whole of the report in relation to pretty much every question that's asked. The implicit in the answer is the numbers. So for me, getting the baseline number or the top line number right is the most fundamental point of the whole paper, because that's what we'll actually have to deliver with the developers and with the landowners and all involved on the ground in East Devon. So, for me, I'm not comfortable with the scale change in the numbers suggested based on the information that we've had. So I go back, I'd like to see and understand the detail of the algorithm. And if government's not prepared to share that, then one's got to question, based on their not too good track record, whether we're justified in accepting it.
But we wouldn't be accepting it in our response to the consultation. We can certainly add, and that the committee requests further details as to the algorithm used to calculate the numbers of housing that are proposed for the district.
Well, maybe I'd just like to be a bit stronger. I think our leader's pretty good at coming forward for words to circumstances like this, and perhaps he has a view.
We'll go to Councillor Kevin Blakey next, as he's been having his hand up for a while now, and then we'll come back.
Thank you, Chairman. Just a couple of very brief points. With regard to the numbers on page 18, it seems to me that nobody at any point at government level has taken a common sense overview at those figures, because I think to anybody you'd look at that and think, well, it's nonsense. But that aside, if what the government is trying to do here is to control market prices by arranging oversupply, it's likely to backfire, because first of all, developers aren't going to be very keen to be developing properties that they then find themselves unable to sell, or at least not sell quickly. And that in itself is going to knock on to the viability of any developments. And we are all very well aware of how that then impacts on what we and the district can actually get from those developments. So the whole thing, to me, couldn't possibly work. And that's all I have to say on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Blakey. Move on to Councillor Nick Hookway.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, yeah, I'd like to add I agree with virtually all the comments that have been stated. I think it's an excellent response by Ed Freeman. My impressions of all this consultation is that it's half-baked. I think that it's an attempt of a one-size-fits-all for all parts of the country. I think Councillor Thomas hit the nail on the head when he mentioned the Northern Powerhouse. I'm quite sure that some of these ideas that have come down from government are to enable the Northern Powerhouse to progress, and there has been no thought given whatever to districts such as ours. I'm also a little bit surprised that we haven't really mentioned anything to do with COVID-19, because I think the impact of that upon the entire economy is going to be significant, and has probably been underestimated by many people and underplayed by many people. So I'd just like to say, yes, I think Councillor Thomas is right to question our response, and I think we need to have perhaps a slightly stronger recommendation to Capital Full Council. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I think from the debate, everyone agrees that pretty much with the premise of what's been prepared by Mr. Freeman. Can we actually have a proposal for?
Can I second Ian's amendment, Chair? Perhaps he did invite me to help him with some wording. Can I just suggest some? So that we'd accept the recommendation as written, full stop. And the next line would be that we publish our response to the consultation, and in both our covering letter and public statements express our profound concerns regarding the algorithm utilised by government, full stop. Is that any good for Councillor Thomas?
Thank you very much for your literary talents, Paul, in providing words which I'm perfectly happy to propose. And somebody ought to note somewhere that we've actually agreed on something on the minutes. That might be worthy of record.
There's another 2.5 years of this to come.
Oh, don't bank on it.
Oh well.
Proposed by Councillor Thomas, seconded by Councillor Arnott. Yes. Fantastic. Yes. Committee, do you want to debate anything else? If you keep your hands up, if you still want to add anything to the debate, or we'll move on. Councillor Eleanor Islands.
Thank you, Chair. So I'm going to sound like a broken record at the moment, but I don't see very much in there about tackling climate change, really. I mean, there's very, very little about, strategic transport infrastructure or anything like that that should go with any push to build thousands and thousands of houses. So if we don't resist this move to build 1,600 houses a year, we're essentially going to end up covering the West End of East Devon realistically in houses with no transport infrastructure and no more than a nod to building standards or building quality or addressing, the need for minimal energy usage in these houses. It's just depressing, really, that we're still talking about major estates without tackling really essential things. Where is the transport infrastructure going to come from here? It's all infrastructure delivered on the back of thousands of houses, none of which is going to be sufficient to build, say, for example, a new train line or even dual a train line. You know, it's just astonishing that we're talking about strategic planning and we're not actually doing any strategic planning. We're just planning housing estates. So how can we insert a higher focus on climate change into this response? I mean, I would like to see even more focus on it, to be honest, and just kick it back to them and say, look, we are as a country trying to meet a 2050 carbon neutrality deadline. We can't do that, A, with the national building standards as they are at the moment, because we're still building houses out of cardboard. I mean, will they even last till 2050, the ones that are built at the moment? And B, because we're not actually proactively tackling transport issues. And can we please beef anything, you know, add anything to this response about this? Because I really, really think that they're being very tin-eared about this, given that the government itself signed up to a 2050 deadline and Devon has signed up to East Devon signed up to 2040, but Devon itself is at 2050, isn't it? I just feel like we could be doing a lot more through planning to tackle climate change. I don't know what Ed feels about this.
And is this more for the next item under the planning white paper, or is this something that we can add into this consultation?
Thank you, Chairman. I don't see any harm in adding something into this consultation, but I was just looking ahead to the report on the white paper, and I think we have perhaps touched on those issues a bit more in our response to the question about the standard method. I think it's question 8 in that report, and said about how we're more interested in focusing on quality outcomes rather than the numbers of homes in that one. So certainly it's probably more fitting to that question and to bolster that one, but I don't see any problem in bolstering both if that's members' wish.
Okay. Councillor Mike Allen.
Thank you, Chairman. In question 8, it talks about will you present evidence? That's the question. We don't actually present any evidence there, Ed, and I think that there are instances throughout the report where some pertinent facts would be very useful. So could you at least put in there the last housing needs review that we did through independent consultants? Is there anything that we could append to this feedback that would actually have hard evidence in it? The second thing is with regard to Councillor Hayward, he obviously doesn't understand the economics of house building. If he really wanted to understand the approach he's taking, he should visit Russia and the slums that were created. Thank you.
Councillor Phil Skinner.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, I didn't realise my hand was up. It's all been said. I'm supporting Councillor Thomas. Thank you.
So unless there's any other people wishing to speak, Councillor Paul Hayward.
Thank you, Chair. I'd just like to respond to Councillor Allen as I've been named. There are thousands of social developments around the world. Vienna is a prime example that are not slums. They're actually almost visionary ways of delivering. And so to just quote Russian slums, you know, arguably when I listened to Kit Malthouse about 2 years ago at Exeter Racecourse, he was claiming that the house building of today will be the award-winning houses of the future, and we'll be listing these buildings in 20 years. Well, coming back to Councillor Rylance's point, a lot of them won't be around in 20 years. They would have fallen down. So that's what we're currently doing. We're not building for the future. We're building for profit, and we're not delivering. So I would urge Councillor Allen to widen his outlook, step away from his socialist, communist hatred, and actually look at countries which aren't socialist and which are capitalist, if that's a phrase, but are delivering social housing for the positive, proper reasons that governments represent their people. They don't represent the interests of private housing developers. But Councillor Allen, thank you for allowing me to point out the error of your ways. Thank you.
I think we're distracting from the actual agenda again. So can we just keep on the agenda item and we'll move on? We'll move to a vote. So we've had a proposal by Councillor Ian Thomas. It's been seconded. Committee, Shirley, do you want to just verbally confirm the proposed motion?
Could I just check before I do that, that the proposer and seconder accept the bolstering of the response in relation to the climate change, as Ed Freeman said that was possible. I don't know whether they wish to take that up.
I'd be very happy to include it in if you wish, if members wish. My only worry with all these things is the more different things we actually put in, the potential to lose focus on specific ones that are pertinent in the item itself. I'm not saying for a second or trivializing the climate change impact or even the COVID impact, but the danger with this is that however it's achieved, and I'm not assuming that that isn't within any form of algorithm, but on the other hand, whatever the algorithm form it does take is giving us a number that's not acceptable or not defensible as far as I can see. Now, so that to me is the key point, which Councillor Arnott so eloquently expanded on.
Thank you. In that case, the only motions that I have on the table are that the committee note the report and agree the proposed responses to the consultation, and we publish our response to the consultation, and in both the covering letter and publicity express our profound concerns to the algorithm used. Members, please press your yes button if you are in support of the motion. Please press your no button if you're against the motion, or please raise your blue hand to indicate you're abstaining from the vote. Thank you.
So for the benefit of those watching us on YouTube, the vote is now taking place.
Sorry, my apologies, Chair, but has Councillor Arnott intentionally abstained from that as the seconder of it?
I'm having a button crisis. No, I've got it right, Ian. Thank you.
I like to keep my eyes on you, you know.
Okay, it looks as though we've stabilised at an overall majority. That is carried, Chairman. No abstentions.
Thank you, Debbie. So we'll move on to agenda item 8, planning white paper, implications and proposed responses, page 35. Again, over to you, Mr. Ed Freeman, to present your report.
Thank you, Chairman. So obviously a bit of a weightier tome, this consultation, so I'll try and give you a quick overview, and then obviously we can go through it in more detail. Fundamentally, the white paper identifies that the current planning system is too complex. It says planning decisions are made on a discretionary case-by-case basis rather than by clear rules, which makes it uncertain and creates risks for the development industry. So it takes too long to adopt a local plan. The assessments of housing need, viability and environmental impacts are too complex and opaque. It says the system has lost public trust, very much based in the 20th century on 20th century technology. It says negotiations on developer contributions are too complex, protracted and unclear. There's not enough focus on design and delivering high quality homes and places, and it does not lead to enough homes being built. The consultation introduces a new vision for the planning system to address these issues. It says it wants the system to be more ambitious for the places we create, focusing on net gain rather than no net harm. Move democracy forward in the planning process to give neighbourhoods and communities an earlier and more meaningful voice. Improve the user experience. Support home ownership. Increase the supply of land available for new homes, economic growth, and the renewal of towns and cities. Help businesses to expand, support innovative developers and house builders, promote stewardship and improvement of the countryside, and create a virtuous circle of prosperity in our villages, towns, and cities. Goes on to detail 3 main pillars for achieving that. First of which is planning for development, and talks about the nationally set target of 300,000 homes per annum with binding targets for local authorities, as we've already discussed. It talks about scrapping the 5-year land supply and duty to cooperate. Creating local plans that are based on interactive maps, based on a 30-month time frame for preparation, and identifying growth, renewal and protected land areas. Updating the NPPF so that it becomes the primary source of development management policies, an emphasis on engagement at the plan making stage, a single statutory sustainable development test, and a digital first approach. It seems to us, and as documented in the report, that this first pillar creates a number of key issues. We've already discussed the new standard method for housing numbers and the outcomes of that. It's unclear how local constraints are to be taken into account and by whom, although it's obviously reassuring to some extent that there's acknowledgement of the need to do that. There doesn't appear to be a strategy for where growth is accommodated across England within the consultation, and the calculator simply focuses growth where it's previously happened and where the affordability gap is at its greatest. So basically just perpetuating previous trends by putting growth where it's always happened without consideration to whether or not that's the appropriate response or a clear methodology for doing so. As I say, the 5-year housing land supply test is to be abandoned, but the housing delivery test remains. So there would still be consequences of not delivering the housing numbers that are, according to the government, at least needed. As I say, the duty to cooperate is also proposed to be abandoned, but it does not negate the need for some cooperation and partnership working to deliver the best outcomes for the area. New simplified local plans, I think, are to be welcomed. However, it's unclear exactly how the 30-month process could be achieved, and it appears to show less engagement with our communities than the current process, despite the key aims, as I outlined, being to promote greater engagement and interaction with communities on planning issues. And the single sustainability test, while welcomed in theory, there's no real detail about how this would operate and how this differs from the current system. The second pillar in the consultation talks about planning for beautiful and sustainable places, and talks about a new national model design code and a revised manual for streets to complement the existing national design guide. The creation of local design codes and guides to be prepared with community involvement by local planning authorities as part of the plan making process. Having a national design body to support greater design. The introduction of a fast track process for beauty. Changes to the NPPF to require all new streets to be tree lined, and for each authority to have a chief officer for design and placemaking. A couple of key issues for us to draw out of the report on that pillar are really the greater emphasis on design is clearly welcomed and something we've already touched on. But upfront design coding appears to be in conflict with a 30-month timescale for local plans. Design coding is inevitably time consuming, and trying to do that within a 30-month timescale is, in our belief as officers, problematic, particularly if we're doing that for every allocated site. And linked to that is it raises a number of significant resource issues. But clearly we do want to see a greater emphasis on design and quality. So in principle, I think that's welcome. In terms of pillar 3, this talks about planning for infrastructure and connected places, and is fundamentally about substantial changes to the funding of infrastructure through a new fixed rate infrastructure levy that would replace Section 106 agreements and community infrastructure levy, and would be based on the final value of development. It proposes increased flexibility for local authorities on how the levy is spent, extends the levy to capture changes of use, even those coming through permitted development rights, such as the recent introduction of permitted development rights to the change of use of offices to dwellings under a prior notification process, which is currently not captured. Local authorities being able to borrow against future receipts through the levy, which you can't currently do under SIL, and new provisions for how affordable housing would be delivered as offset for the levy. A number of key issues to draw out of the report on that pillar, I think, relate to a distinct lack of detail in terms of the new infrastructure levy and how that would work, and whether it would achieve the benefits that the consultation suggests that it would. It potentially appears to us to be just as complicated as SIL, and it's unclear what the consequences might be for the delivery of affordable housing. It's potentially quite complicated if that's an offset against the levy rather than delivered directly through a Section 106 agreement, for example. It does, however, increase flexibility on spend, and I think this is to be welcomed. However, it does raise questions about whether or not it's going to yield substantially more funding for infrastructure, which has to be its first focus in terms of the spend of the money, as to whether or not we would actually benefit from that greater flexibility. We obviously have a massive shortfall in funding for infrastructure, and it's difficult to see how these changes would bridge that gap. Equally, extending the levy to include changes of use, I think, is welcome, as is potential to borrow against future receipts, I think. The final section of the consultation talks about how these changes are to be delivered, and talks about things like a comprehensive resource and skills strategy for the planning sector, making the planning system very much more self-funding on a cost recovery basis, strengthening planning enforcement powers and sanctions, focus on greater use of technology, particularly in the development management process and plan making, a new performance framework, and a regulatory review to eliminate outdated regulations. In terms of key issues, I think the new resources and skills strategy is welcomed and will be needed given the scale of changes that are proposed. The principle of funding planning activities through a cost recovery process, I think, is also welcomed. The service is currently a drain on the core finances of the council, and it being more self-supporting, I think, is beneficial to the council's funding as a whole, and makes sense as well. It is something that's actually been looked at in the past, so there's lots of work that was done some years ago on how that might work. Strengthening enforcement powers, I think, is also to be welcomed. There is a lack of detail in terms of how this would operate in the consultation, but I think we always feel as officers, and I'm sure as members, slightly helpless when it comes to some enforcement powers, and that our powers are somewhat unhelpful in a number of circumstances. And indeed, I think the greater use of digital technology is welcomed, but there are obviously funding issues in terms of how that can be achieved, the availability of that technology, and how the public might utilise it is obviously limited by local broadband speeds, which particularly in our rural areas are quite slow. So that's a very quick whistle-stop tour through the consultation. As I say, there are detailed comments on each proposal and a draft response in the papers. These responses are recommended for members' agreement. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. We'll start with non-committee members. So, Councillor Paul Miller.
Thank you, Chair. A forensic and astute response, draft response there from Mr. Freeman, which I support. I think it's been very well written. There are 2 points I wish to make. Firstly, on the local plan and the timing. We've obviously recently left the GESP, and part of, I think we should be being a little bit more detailed in that response to say that whilst we don't think 13 months is, we think 13 months is too much of a stretch. We also feel that it can be done a lot quicker than it has been traditionally in other councils. My second point is in relation to the fact that in this planning white paper, there is not one mention of social housing. And I don't know whether we can include that in our response anywhere, but I think this is an absolute disgrace. I mean, Councillor Ingham mentioned it earlier, despite the fact it's his own government, saying that and I completely agree with him. He said that we should only build houses, especially given the climate emergency, to the people that really need them. And Councillor Skinner was talking about Councillor Hayward being a socialist. I mean, it's just a ridiculous thing to say, given that it was a Conservative Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan, who built more council houses than any other Prime Minister. Now, so my suggestion for the committee is that we need, in some way, I think, to include our disappointment or our objection to the fact that there is no provision for social housing. Because we don't, if we're going to build these homes, we don't want them to be going to second homeowners, private landlords. It's not progressive. There are too many people that are homeless in this country and in our district. So we need to change that. Thank you.
I think just on your first point there, Paul, it all depends on how much consultation the government have basically set for us to undertake within our local plan, and that will dictate how long it will take for a local plan to come through. So, Councillor Bruce Sarum.
Oh yeah, thank you. Thank you, Chairman. Yes, two very quick points. On 3.8, it said that what is proposed as a blunt policy tool. I wonder how that can be improved. And also, my suggestion to the committee is that in digital planning, it's very clear that the public want to see access to documents. And it says these will be published online in standardized form with digital data, allowing people to respond to consult on smartphones. I appreciate that there was a funding issue and broadband issue as advised by Ed, but I think that the committee should somehow put forward a motion to say that they would support this so that the public could get more access and more use of the planning system. And also reverted to my first point, that basically this isn't going to be just because you zone the area, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be a developer's charter, because I know there's been great concern about where homes are allocated, and I think we need to reassure members that this isn't going to allow these sort of things to take place. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Bruce. Does any other non-committee member wish to speak at this time? Take that as a no. Councillor Eleanor Rylance.
Thank you, Chair. Oh, so this is a question for Ed again. It's quite specific. On page 64, item 4.60, it mentions that energy efficiency standards potentially will be taken away from local authority areas and handed over to a national planning framework. Is there any indication whether that's the motivation behind that is to level up or level down? I mean, would there be upper limits imposed, or would it be minimum limits? What does it say in the actual paper about that? Can you remember? That's my first question.
Ed, do you have anything, or do you want us to come back to you?
Yeah, do you want to give me a couple of minutes so I can check the main paper? Thanks.
No problem. Councillor Ian Thomas.
Thank you very much, Chair. Worrying overtones in the whole of this white paper, and similarly the previous paper we just discussed, pretty much nicely summed up, I think, in Ed's response to question 7b on page 42. I think the overriding thing to come through this for me is that where we do appear to have is localism's dead. And basically, in the same way as we're re-centralising numbers, we're re-centralising the epitome and judgment in good design. I mean, I'm sure we all trust Boris to design the best possible houses out there and communities. We seem to have completely ignored, when we go back up to question 3.19 on the proposal 3 on page 41, I'm really concerned about two things. Firstly, the abolition of the current need for sustainability assessment. The whole point of what we used to do, and up till recently it seems, is look to develop sustainable communities, sustainable in all respects in terms of the facilities they provide, not just homes and houses, but in terms of all the other services, educational services, employment services, economical services, leisure services, the whole thing. Now we seem to have abolished that, this is in the proposal. That is again another fundamental shift. Looking at the removal of the requirement of a duty to cooperate. Actually, one more cynical than me could conclude from that is that the best way to effectively remove the requirement duty to cooperate across boundaries, remove the boundaries. Because effectively, if you move to unitary councils governed in a completely different structure, You don't need district councils to be liaising cross borders and working together because there won't be any. Now, maybe that's just cynical, or maybe that's another way of how these proposals might hang together. As far as slimming down needs to delivery and all these sorts of things, there's a lot of good stuff in Ed's report there, but maybe just a little bit the elephant in the corner for me, that again, the fundamental point of this, in the same way as the fundamental point last time was the housing numbers, the fundamental point of this is that it's a massive re-centralization. No references to communism or anything else like that from me, but more a case of it's just the philosophy of centralization I don't like. And this government's done nothing to suggest to me that actually it can manage that in a competent, coherent manner. So again, if I was going to put another flavour bit in the recommendation, it would be that we express our concern about the overriding centralisation of the planning process, right down, not just in a national strategic level or a regional level, but right down to effectively almost individual design of schemes and communities. I don't think that's what localism was all about. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Thomas. Is that a proposal?
Happy to propose it, and maybe Councillor Arnott might like to second it again, or unless anybody else wants to get involved.
No, I'll happily second it. Do you want me to? The problem is you said it in one glorious sentence and then you went on for a bit. Can you remember the first line you said?
The first line was that we have a fundamental concern about the end of localism and centralisation of planning in government.
Full stop. Shirley, have you got that? Seconded.
If I can assist, I did write down originally, we express our concern at the over-centralisation of the planning process. Is that?
That's the overriding point, Shirley. Thank you very much. And I'm happy to propose that as an addition of flavour to the recommendation if colleagues agree.
Thank you, Councillor Thomas. Councillor Mike Allen.
Yeah, thank you very much. I want to pick up the statement that Paul Miller came in with about social housing, because I totally agree with him. The critical need is to build more social housing, and this is ignored in this white paper. And therefore, the rest of the white paper, with all due regard to the previous comments, is reducing democracy, centralising everything, and clearly is not in favour of local determination. That is not acceptable. It's not acceptable that we don't enhance the sustainability. When I was developing our current local plan, my emphasis all the way through it was sustainability. And I even had to force the Brunstad definition into the local plan to make sure that people really understood what sustainability was about right the way through the plan. Here we have something that tries to rip it all up. It's not acceptable. So I would like to suggest that in addition to the one sentence that has been proposed, that we also deplore the lack of emphasis on social housing and the lack of emphasis on accessible housing, where we do applaud the emphasis on design and web access. We think that in all cases, these elements have to be brought before the local population for acceptance. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Allen. I see Councillor Andrew Moulding's joined us. Good afternoon, Andrew.
Afternoon, Chairman.
Andrew, do you have any declarations of interest you'd like to?
I don't, no.
Thank you very much. If we just go back to Ed Freeman to cover Councillor Eleanor Rylance's point.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. So just checking through the white paper, there is a proposal in terms of energy efficiency standards, but there's no actual consultation questions to respond to. And I don't think it really, proposal 18 really says anything new. It kind of links back to the Future Homes Standard, which was consulted on last year, which is basically a phased approach to reaching net zero carbon by 2050. The first phase of which is getting to sort of 75 to 80% lower CO2 emissions compared to current levels by 2025. I think when it talks about who has control over that, I think it's referring to the Future Homes consultation talked about achieving that through changes to building regulations. So effectively, under what they consulted on, there wouldn't be local plan policies requiring CO2 reductions in terms of new properties or even net zero carbon. It would all be done through building regulations and changes to Part L of the building regulations, which we did comment on at the time, because it did seem to take some of that local control away in terms of setting our own standards and leave it to national standards set through building regulations. But conversely, it has a benefit in terms of building controller obviously there to make sure that those requirements are then implemented through the build out of proposals. So enforcement of it becomes easier when it's done through building control. There's no danger of people arguing their way out of it on viability grounds or something like that through the planning process. So there are pros and cons either way, but I think that's what it's referring to, is this move to building control, having greater powers over these issues and less control through the planning process. But the government haven't responded to the responses they received to the Future Homes consultation. So we still wait to see what they're actually going to do in terms of implementing those proposals. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. Councillor Ryan, does that answer your question?
Yes, thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Move on to Councillor Nick Hookway.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Yes, I have to say I was very pleased to read Ed Freeman's report, and I'm also, because I think it reflects accurately what's happening in the district, I also agree with a lot of the comments that have been said so far, particularly Councillor Thomas in terms of localism is dead. I think he's absolutely right here. Again, I go back to what I said before. I think this is a one size fits all. In some parts of the country, in some of the bigger urban areas, it might work absolutely perfectly to having areas that are designed for renewal and for growth. You might be able to do that very quickly indeed. But I don't think that's going to happen in areas such as ours, in districts such as ours. The one area of Ed's response that I would query is his response to question 9A on page 49, when he talks about automatic outline planning permission for areas of substantial development. He says, yes, he's in favour of that. I think that answer should be no, because I think what's happening there is that not only that is that undemocratic, but critically, there will be a lack of scrutiny. And I think it's this lack of scrutiny that is one of the most worrying aspects of these changes. We cannot allow these sorts of things to go through. We know what some of the things that certain politicians get up to when they're friends, they have dinner together. You know, this can be a bit of a Spivs charter if we're not careful. So scrutiny is my really big concern over over the white paper. Thank you, Chair.
We'll go to Councillor Paul Arnott and let Ed fill in afterwards.
Thank you, Chair. I was just looking, forgive me for some, just for some wording that might assist bringing Mike's in, Councillor Allen's in to tag on to Councillor Thomas's original proposal with its extra line. If I just suggest it and then, deal with it as you wish, that third line might be, the committee also notes the lack of consideration for social housing, and the lack of scrutiny resulting from the centralisation of planning powers, full stop. I'm just putting that out there as an idea. I don't know if that covers both Mike and Nick, perhaps. Thank you.
So, Councillor Thomas, would you happy to accept that amendment?
Yeah, I think that's helpful. Thank you very much, Chair. I mean, I think what we've done is we've got the balance between not moving away from making the salient fundamental point, but we have added 2 other very important points onto that. Again, assuming colleagues are in agreement.
Chair, through you, I didn't quite catch the last part of that sentence from Councillor Arnott. I've got, and the committee also notes lack of consideration of affordable housing and lack of. There was some further text.
So the committee also notes the lack of consideration for social housing, comma, and the lack of scrutiny resulting from the centralisation of planning powers. Can I put proposed centralisation of planning powers?
Proposed centralisation of planning powers. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Shirley. We'll go to Councillor Eleanor Rylance, and then I think we'll take it to a vote.
Chair, I'm okay now, thank you. What I was about to say was addressed just now.
Perfect. Thanks very much. Shirley, do you want to just reconfirm everything, and then we'll go to the vote?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, the motion now before you, members, is to note the report and agree the proposed responses to the consultation, and we express our concern over the over-centralisation of the planning process, and the committee notes the lack of consideration for social housing and the lack of scrutiny resulting from the proposed centralisation of planning powers. So members, please press your yes button.
Sorry, just a quick point of order. There was a question raised over question 9A to turn it from yes to no, which I think was a very good suggestion, but we didn't respond to that, Chairman. So I think we ought to actually decide that.
Apologies, Mike. You're very much, you're right. Ed, did you have anything to come back with?
Yes, so I think Councillor Hookway's concern was that this route would be undemocratic and lack scrutiny. I suppose why I didn't have those concerns was I think the process would ensure that there's appropriate scrutiny and engagement in those proposals through the plan preparation process, because it would only be granting automatic outline consent for something that's allocated through the local plan. And obviously the local plan process would have been discussed at length through this committee and others, and through public consultation and engagement exercises. And obviously we would need to ensure that we had the equivalent level of information to grant outline planning permission at that stage, and that was appropriately scrutinised through the plan making process before an allocation is made. So a lot of the devil's in the detail, as it were, in terms of these proposals, but I think on the assumption that that's what would happen, I think we could ensure that it is suitably democratic and there is suitable scrutiny. But happy to revise the text as members see fit if members are concerned about that.
Councillor Hookway, how is that for you?
Well, Ed, of course, has given an excellent explanation of what should happen, but I think when we're doing a reply and a consultation that's going to be read by politicians, we need to be a little bit more blunt, and I think we ought to say no because we're concerned about lack of scrutiny, but that's my own personal view, but of course I'll leave it up to the committee. But you know, Ed is absolutely right, and there will be the process, but I think we need to send the message that we have serious concerns. Thank you, Chair.
I do support Councillor Hookway's alteration as a proposal.
That's now two separate motions. Shirley, how would you like to deal with that?
We do have the proposal in the names of Thomas and Arnott. Are they prepared to accept that amendment by adding note the report and agree the post responses to the consultation with an amendment to question A to read no, and the appropriate wording you wish inserted, or is this going to be an amendment to that motion that we already have? It's for members to decide.
Councillor Thomas?
I mean, it's hard to no, sorry, I am still alive. In terms of judging whether in fact that you would get exactly the same response, because Ed Freeman's given a response to the concern. Now, I mean, I can't judge what are 20 of us in the committee, what all their individual views are going to be on that, as to whether that's an acceptable response to remove the need for the 9A change or not. Is it possible, Shirley, that, or Chair, through you, that we could actually take the answer to whether we include the 9A separately, a yes or no, and on the basis of the outcome from that, actually include it or not in the substantive amendment? The point with that being is, if, for example, it's included at this point without knowing what people's views are, there's a risk that the whole would fall, whereas in fact that might not be the. I'm trying to second judge outcomes here and make sure the process goes correctly. So if it would be possible, I'd suggest that we take the possible inclusion of the amendment to 9A first, and then based on the outcome of that, we then come back with the substantive amendment. I'm getting nods there in Shirley's thing now. I assume you're agreeing with that, yeah?
If yourself and Councillor Arnott are not willing to accept that amendment to your already proposed, then Councillor Hookway's and Councillor Allen's amendment would become an amendment which would be voted on first.
That is how and it's not that I'm not prepared to accept it because I don't agree with it. It's because I'm not prepared to, I don't think it's appropriate to accept it because I don't know the views of others. So and I wouldn't want it to make or break the substantive change. So that would be, if we're happy to do that through you, Chair, then I think that's the best way to tackle it.
Happy to.
And if
would you like me to read out the amended motion, Chairman?
Yes, please.
Therefore, we have an amended motion to note the report and agree the proposed responses to the consultation with an amendment to the answer to question 9A within the report, which should be a no, as the committee believes it would be undemocratic and result in a lack of scrutiny.
Fantastic, thank you.
I see Councillor Thomas is sitting with his hand raised. I didn't know whether he wanted me to stop.
No, it's just that wasn't what I was suggesting. What I was suggesting is part the substantive thing that we've already largely agreed on, and before we finalise the wording of that, actually have a simple yes or no vote on the answer to question 9A. Now, if the answer to question 9A is that it stays as it is, then there's no amendment needed to the first resolution, and that can then go forward. On the other hand, if there is a change agreed in response to 9A, then that is then appended to the main resolution, and then we roll that.
Apologies, I thought you were making an amendment or agreeing to it to being an amendment to your motion. Therefore, Chair, it is up to you whether you wish to take a straw poll from members outside the motion as to what response members wish to make to the question 9A separately.
Well, if we could do that, I think it would just move us on a little bit quicker. I think we're arguing pedantics now. So if we just take a vote on that.
Yeah, Chairman, I'm just going to clear. There are some blue hands up, so I'm going to clear before we take any vote. Otherwise, there'll be a lot of abstentions, that it would appear to be.
Can we speak on the amendment?
Sorry, I didn't hear that.
I said, can we speak on the amendment? Because we haven't really discussed this amendment at all, either of them yet.
Of course, go ahead.
Well, I'd just like to pick up this point on question 9A, because actually I'm in support of Ed's answer on this, and I'll explain why. It actually adds democracy. It also makes life simpler and better. Over my experience with our planning teams and this council, there have been numerous occasions where we've had to deal with, at planning application stage, things that should have been dealt with at local plan stage. And this gets over that issue by putting a greater emphasis on the local plan, making sure the work's done for affordability, viability, access, and everything else at local plan stage when the application is done. So to me, it is actually more important that we answer yes, because the work for the local plan will then prove these allocations or disprove these allocations, instead of going through at a later date with an allocation that is unviable and unfeasible. So to me, democracy will say its part as the local plan development, and then we need to do the work, the council needs to do the work to make sure that those allocations that do go through the local plan are fully set in their ways, that everything is dealt with, that we know before they ever get there. So to me, it makes more sense to do it all up front, so we know the allocation will work, rather than allocating something that in theory should never have been and then arguing like hell afterwards. So actually, I'm in support of 9A being a yes, and I hope the committee will do the same. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Paul Arnott.
Thank you, Chair. I agree with what Mike's just said, but I think he's answering. It's like somebody doing a French exam and answering something for a German O-level instead. What we're doing here, Mike, is we're responding to the planning white paper, which is putting forward this idea, these three things, one of which is growth areas. Now, your principle is, of course, absolutely correct in another context, but in our response to this, it's a very dangerous answer to put yes. So I actually found, this only take me 10 seconds, the quote from yesterday from the Secretary of State. And he said, I'm just going to repeat this, existing large-scale allocations will in future be automatically granted outline planning permission. They wouldn't have to re-argue the permission. So in other words, I believe, my understanding of this is that what's proposed under this growth area idea is not our kind of growth area, the enterprise zone and all the rest of it east of Exeter. It's this new definition. And if we answer yes to that, even though we understand the nuances behind it and what Councillor Howes just said, I think they'll think we're in favour of it, when I think most of us aren't. I think that's my take on it, Chair. Thank you.
Okay, we'll have Councillor Allen and then we'll move to a vote.
Actually, Councillor Arnott put it very clearly, and I think that although Mike Howe is in principle very sensible, when it comes to this particular response, we need to be crystal clear that we don't like the idea of this particular fast route. If you consider that 1/3 of our district could be classified as a growth area and they get it automatically outline permission, that could be a devastating effect on our whole area. So I think it ought to proceed to a vote, and the vote ought to be no. We don't want that.
Thank you, Councillor Allen. Debbie, can we move to the vote, please?
Yes, of course, Chairman. Okay, so Shirley, would you like to read out what the committee are voting on?
This is a straw poll of members as to their support for Councillor Hookway's proposed amendment to question 9A in relation to the answer should be no, as the result would be undemocratic and lack scrutiny. If you could please put tick yes, a tick for yes, a cross for no, and raise your blue hand for abstention.
Okay. If we agree with the change, we're voting yes, and if we don't agree with it, we vote no.
Yes, correct.
Okay.
Okay, so for the benefit of anyone watching us online at the moment, the vote is now taking place. I'll just give it a few moments.
Mr. Chair, may I just check? Councillor Moulding has abstained. Is that correct?
That is correct from the poll.
Can I speak on that, Chairman?
course.
Chairman, can we finish the vote first, please? Would that be okay?
Yeah, of
Or
course.
I'll straw poll. Okay, so we are, that's a clear majority of yes as interchange to no, and then the one abstention. So, Councillor Moulding, sorry to stop you in your flow there.
Yes, Chairman, you'll know as you welcomed me only about half an hour ago to the meeting, so therefore I didn't have the opportunity of hearing the debate, and it would be totally improper for me to vote on the amendments to the proposition. And although I have very, very rarely abstained on anything at this council, on this occasion, due to my late arrival and not hearing the debate, I can only abstain. I can't vote yes or no. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Moulding. So if we move to the new motion now and actually take a vote on that. So Shirley, can you just confirm for everyone, because I'm sure they're confused by now, or the exact motion that they're now voting for?
Before I read it out, could I just check with the proposer and seconder that they accept that Councillor Hookway's amendment that had the support of the members at the
Thank
committee?
you, Shirley. With the support of members, that will be very welcome.
Agreed.
Thank you. Therefore, the motion is that members note the report and agree the proposed responses with the amendment to question 9A as just voted on, and we express our concern of the over-centralisation of the planning process, and the committee also notes the lack of consideration for social housing and lack of scrutiny resulting from the proposed centralisation of planning powers. If members please press your yes button if you're in support of the motion.
Can I just, sorry, can I just, Ian, I just wondered, is that last, are we repeating ourselves there at the end with the two mentions of centralisation? I'm just thinking how this is going to look in black and white.
Yeah, I think it could be edited out. So we'd only mention centralisation further up. It's a drafting thing. It doesn't affect the principle.
Therefore, if I could delete that last sentence so that it reads that the committee also notes for, the lack of consideration for social housing, full stop. Is that agreed by the proposer and the seconder?
Have we lost the word scrutiny in there? No.
So, and the lack of scrutiny resulting from proposed centralisation. Is that?
Let's just have and the lack of scrutiny, full stop. Ian, do you think?
Full stop.
I think so,
Yep.
because it's mentioned. Yep. The centralisation point is at the head of the thing, which is where it should be.
Mr. Chair, can I just? Sorry, I'm just coming on this point, and a point has been made. The word "proposed" was put in at the end quite rightly, because this is what's proposed. So if you're going to take it out of the end, and I appreciate it's a semantic point, should that not be the proposed over-centralisation? Because that was the point in Councillor Thomas made, that we're going back to an overtly centralised way, essentially reversing what Mr. Pickles said, and Ed touched on it very, very lucidly in his report. So with your agreement, Councillor Thomas and Councillor Arnott, that we retain the word proposed, because that's just correct. We've take out the double use of centralisation at the tail end, but ensure that we put proposed at the front end.
Councillor Thomas, we are just.
Hey, but I think that's helpful, Paul. Thank you very much. Happy with that.
Agreed.
Thank you. Shirley, I think we're there.
We are there. Thank you very much. If you would now press, if members are clear, would you please press your yes button if you're in support of the motion, press your no button if you're against the motion, or please raise your blue hand to indicate you're abstaining from the vote. Thank you.
So for the benefit of anyone watching us live at the moment, the vote is now taking place. And that is yes, that is carried, Chairman, with one abstention.
Thank you very much, Debbie. We'll move on to agenda item number 9, adoption and implications of the revised community infrastructure levy charging schedule. Again, we're going to Ed Freeman for his report.
Thank you, Chairman. So members will recall that members resolved to review our SIL charging schedule, and work began on gathering the evidence back at the end of 2017. In August 2019, members agreed to consult on the new charging schedule, which was submitted for examination, and we had hearing sessions taking place in Blackdown House in February, just before lockdown. In early June, we received the examiner's report confirming that the charging schedule is an appropriate basis for applying the levy, and the new rates are in figure 1 in the report. The charging schedule importantly reflects viability profiling across East Devon and increases charges for some forms of development in some locations whilst reducing them in others in line with the viability work. Importantly, the new charging schedule also zero rates Cranbrook so that infrastructure there can be delivered through Section 106 agreements, ensuring greater on-site delivery by developers, which has proven to deliver better value for money and can also ensure more timely delivery of infrastructure. While the viability work was all done prior to the current pandemic, it is considered that the full impact of the pandemic on these issues will not be known for some time and should not serve to delay implementing the new charging schedule. It's therefore recommended that Strategic Planning Committee recommend that Council adopt the new charging schedule with it to take effect from the 1st of February in 2021. This delay is to give the industry sufficient notice of the changes which we are required to do under the SIL regulations. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. Do any non-committee members wish to speak on this? No? Okay, we'll move it into committee. Do any committee members wish to speak? Councillor Kevin Blakey.
Thank you, Chairman. It's simply to say that I think I should register an interest in this as a member of Cranbrook Town Council.
Thank you. Councillor Ellen Rylance.
Thank you, Chair. A question for Ed. Okay, so I noticed that the per square metre cost of SIL is going up in Sidmouth and Budleigh and going down for out-of-centre retail units. What's the motivation behind essentially encouraging out-of-town centre retail, and why is a flat rate of a higher SIL being applied to Sidmouth and Budleigh apparently indiscriminately? I mean, does it apply to houses under 100 square metres in Budleigh and Sidmouth as well, or are those exempt? I'm just concerned that we're going to end up creating ghettos, really, I suppose is what I'm aiming at, and that Budleigh and Sidmouth will have no affordable housing whatsoever if we're going to be building on this basis. So I'm just wondering what the motivation is behind those two things.
So through you, Chairman, the revised charging schedule is entirely led by viability assessment work that's been undertaken. So the reason why we're proposing to increase the charges in Sidmouth and Budleigh Salterton is because the viability evidence suggests that those developments can afford to pay a higher rate of SIL and still achieve policy compliant levels of affordable housing and all of our other policy requirements. Equally, the evidence shows that out-of-centre retail developments are not as viable as they were when we did the original charging schedule and can no longer afford to pay the original rates, and therefore that it should be reduced for those developments such that they remain viable. Clearly, that's not saying that out-of-centre retail development is encouraged any more than it was before. It would still have to comply with policy, and the sequential test for town centre uses, etc., would still be applied. But if it was found acceptable in planning policy terms, that a lower rates of SIL should be paid because it simply isn't viable for them to pay the previous rates. So it's entirely viability led. That's the entire motivation, to ensure that developments are paying an appropriate rate that's viable and makes the maximum contribution towards the delivery of infrastructure.
Thank you, Ed. Eleanor, does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Hookway.
Oh, thank you, Chair. Yes, Ed, can I just refer you to paragraph 1.6 in your report, where you talk about infrastructure funding, and you talk about the local plan and emerging Cranbrook plan amounting to infrastructure funding of 371.3 million, of which there's anticipated funding of 209.55 million, leaving a funding gap of 161.75 million, with SIL providing up to 26.8, which leaves a overall shortfall of 134.95 million. Now, my question is, how are we intending to make up that shortfall?
That is a very good question. Fundamentally, SIL was never designed to be funding all of the infrastructure requirements. So when it was established, it was intended to be one of a number of measures, and that there would also be other funding sources from central government that we could bid for specific funding and specific projects, and not to mention other sources through government quangos, Homes England, Sport England, things like that. And one of the problems I think has been since the implementation of SIL is that there's been cutbacks in funding to all of those bodies, and therefore a lot of those other funding sources haven't been as readily available as was envisaged, which may well be part of the reason why the government's now looking at revising SIL and creating this infrastructure levy, as has been discussed through the white paper proposals. So it is a fundamental problem that we have this funding gap. We're not alone in that. I think every local authority will have a funding gap of some description, some much bigger than ours, some smaller, I suspect. And how we bridge that gap is the impossible question to answer really at the moment, without knowing what other funding might be available through government in the future. But obviously, if they introduce this new infrastructure levy through the white paper, we might find in a year or two's time that SIL has gone, that this charging schedule would no longer apply, and we're applying a new system, which, according to the government, would help to bridge that funding gap.
Okay,
that helps.
Well, possibly. My concern is, again, is COVID-19, the impact of COVID-19 on government expenditure. Already today, it was announced in the news that Cornwall's had its grant for nuclear airports slashed by 50%. I perhaps think we need to be a bit more proactive in trying to fill that gap. Do we perhaps need to think about providing some form of surcharge on top of SIL payments? I don't know. That's a question I'd like other committee members to give their views on, but we need to think about that shortfall, because we can't let it just sit there.
I think that's for a debate for another day, Nick.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Paul Arnott.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, just looking at figure 1 on page 76, just a couple of questions, a couple of things stick out, and forgive me if Ed and others have already covered this. I mean, going back to the retail out of centre, which we're reducing from 185 to 84, I don't understand that, and there's probably a very clever explanation. I look forward to hearing it. Because aren't we trying to encourage retail in centre at the moment? And then the other question is about this, the general residential development in the rest of East Devon. So at the moment it's 99 quid urban, 154 rural. So we're now making it an across the board 150. So what's happening there, obviously, is that if you're, for sake of argument, building a very agreeable and large manor in a very beautiful part of East Devon, you're now getting a lower rate, aren't you, at 150 per square metre rather than 154. But if what you're trying to develop in an urban area is potentially much needed housing, flats, 1-2 bedrooms and so forth, you're going to end up paying a higher SIL rate. I may well have completely misunderstood this. I'd just love to hear what people and what Ed has to say. Thanks, Jeff.
go to Councillor Mike Howe, and then we'll just come back to Ed in a second.
Thank you very much, and I'm going to add to Ed's problems. I was a bit surprised. I can see him chuckling. Thank you, Ed. On the sheltered housing, extra care housing, and care homes. I agree with the sheltered housing. I agree with the extra care housing being zero, but with the plethora of care homes we've had from large multinational companies in particular, or throughout our district, and particularly Exmouth and Sidmouth, where it goes down like a lead balloon because actually people want affordable homes and houses instead of care homes more. I'm surprised that we're putting it down to zero when we all know they make a good profit. As I say, it just seems an overall catch-all, and I know you've done the viability. I just would like to understand it a bit more, how these companies are doing very well. Thank you very much. And we don't seem to be quite catching the right corner, shall we say. And the only example I can use is Exeter City, where Exeter City played around with their still charging levies a while ago and encouraged student housing. And of course, they set it to zero rate to encourage it. And then every single city councillor absolutely wondered why no one was building houses in Exeter. They all were building student blocks. And it was purely because the developers saw a quick win, an easy buck, and got away with it. And that's what worries me here, is we're not quite being smart enough to identify the areas where we can massage those figures to make sure we're getting the right development, right type of development in the right places, and also keep our revenue as best we can, you know, for the future. But sorry, Ed, challenge for you. Good luck.
Thank you, Councillor Howe. Ed, do you want to come back on both the points there?
Yeah, certainly. So it is entirely led by viability evidence when we set a field charging schedule. So the funding gap, coming back to Councillor Hookway's comment actually, isn't relevant to how we set the charging schedule. So we can't just set charges based on the funding that's needed to deliver infrastructure. It has to be led by the viability assessment under the legislation. So that's what's led all of this in terms of all of the different charges. So for example, in terms of retail, we've never charged for retail within centres. So arguably that is incentivising retail units to be built within the town centres where we want them to be built. But the reality is, on out of town centre sites, the value of those sites is lower. So the viability profile of those developments is greater. There is greater profit to be made. And so the original charging schedule had a charge for that. The reduction in this charging schedule is a reflection that the viability of those sites is not as good as it used to be, which is probably not a surprise when we look at what's happening in the retail sector generally, both before and after COVID-19. So it's entirely reflective of the viability issues. In terms of the care homes, I remember that being raised by the committee when we discussed the draft charging schedule when it went out to consultation. We did look into this, and the evidence we've got suggests that the viability profile of these different types of retirement development, the sheltered housing, extra care housing, and care homes, is not that different. What's slightly deceptive is some of the companies that run these sites are obviously seen to be making substantial money, and are feeling that we should be getting a return through SIL as a portion of that. But a lot of the money they make is through the operation of those sites, through maintenance charges and additional charges that are imposed after the initial purchase of the property, which under the regulations we can't take account of in terms of calculating the SIL. It is purely the value of the development itself. And so that's value that we can't capture through this process. And so that's therefore not reflected in the rates. Again, whether or not the new infrastructure levy the government's now talking about will address that situation and set different charges, I couldn't say at this point. But we've done our best through this charging schedule to extract as much value from developments towards the delivery of infrastructure as we can to try and bridge the infrastructure funding gap as much as is possible within the regulations that exist, but it's all based entirely on viability issues. Hopefully that helps.
Paul, Mike, happy with that?
I suspected that was going to be Ed's answer, and he lived up to my expectations. Thank you very much, Ed. I think it just needs explaining sometimes.
No, agreed with Mike. Thank you, Ed.
Okay, so thanks. If we have no more speakers, does anybody wish to propose? I'm happy to propose it from the chair, the recommendations within the report.
I'll second.
So Shelley, can you just confirm what they're voting on?
Thank you, members. Now, there's two limbs to this motion. The first one is to note the outcome of the examination into the community infrastructure levy draft charging schedule, and then to recommend to Council that the revised community infrastructure levy charging schedule attached at Appendix A to the report is approved with effect from the 1st of February 2021. And again, please members, press your yes button if you are in support of the motion, press your no button if you're against the motion, or please raise your blue hand to indicate you're abstaining from the vote. Thank you.
So for the benefit of those watching us, the vote is now taking place. And Chairman, I can confirm that that is a yes vote. That's carried.
Thank you very
No
much.
abstentions.
Okay, so that brings our meeting to an end. I'd like to thank everyone, including the members of the public watching online, for taking part. However, can I just remind all those present that the supporting officer will confirm when the meeting is no longer being recorded or going live. And until then, your comments will be live to the public. Thank you very much.